Kia ora mai anō. Well, living through a global pandemic brings out the best and worst in people. Now, a new book says the PM staple of "Be Kind" was far more than just a tagline. Dr. Harold Hillman is a clinical psychologist and executive coach and the author of Empathy, the Human Side of Leadership. In his book, he makes a case for a more compassionate and connected approach, and he joins me now. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Will, it's a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you so much. Really nice to have you with us. Listen, let's get straight to it. You started writing Empathy, the Human Side of Leadership, during the first lockdown in 2020. What was the motivation for it?
It just so happened to coincide with the onset of a global pandemic. I am a big advocate of what I call the trust triangle. And particularly if you are a leader, there are three things that you really want to be mindful about. And that is that people experience you as authentic, people experience you as empathetic, and that your logic makes sense. So it's a trust triangle. I had written 2 previous books on authenticity, so I felt that it was time to then write a book on empathy. And the funny thing about this is that in January of 2020, when I started writing it, I was worried that I wouldn't be able to make it practical enough. And then a global pandemic hit, and empathy became a very real construct for all of us.
And what a stage to understand empathy and leadership, right? Because I guess if you look at some of the leaders, perhaps like what you had in the United States with Donald Trump, Boris Johnson in the UK, and then in Aotearoa, we've got Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Very different takes, right? The UK, you hear Boris say, let the bodies pile up. In Aotearoa, you hear our Prime Minister say, be kind.
That's right. And in between that was the U.S. President, Donald Trump, who was suggesting that it was a hoax. And so, you know, adversity helps to define character, and we learn a lot about leaders as they are working through adversity. And it is really encouraging that New Zealand became a global benchmark for empathy in terms of looking after each other, uniting as an army of 5 million, and taking on this insidious, invisible enemy.
What about this idea of empathy being the new frontier? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Empathy is core to emotional intelligence. And at 66 years of age, I'm old enough to remember when EQ, emotional intelligence, was first introduced back in 1995 in a book by an author called Daniel Goleman. And he proposed that within 20 years, which would be now, emotional intelligence would be more important than IQ. EQ would be more important than IQ in determining a person's success in leadership and in life. And I think the last year and a half has certainly put that into perspective for all of us.
Does that translate to the business world, I wonder? Because when you think of successful business leaders, you often think of very stoic, sometimes really tough leaders. Are you making the case, well, you can actually be compassionate and that might work for your bottom line?
That's right. Look, 30 years ago, people were promoted on the basis of their technical expertise in organizations. And so even if they had no relationship skills, they often made it to very senior levels. That has changed now in terms of how talented people progress through an organization. You're not only judged on what you do, but how you do it, because the how, in many respects, determines whether or not you can even attract and retain the best talent. People are not, particularly young people, and Generation Z, millennials and Gen Z, these younger people stepping into the workforce now want to be appreciated for their thinking, not just their doing.
Do certain cultures do it better than others, I wonder? Because if you got that very old school colonial attitude perhaps versus a more holistic, caring attitude, do some do it better than others?
Some cultures really do. In Nordic countries, Norway, Denmark, they start teaching empathy to kids in public education, in kindergarten. and right through to emphasize that that one of the core things around influence is to be able to connect with people more effectively. There's some nations that are a bit colder than that. As a gay man, I still find it absolutely abhorrent that homosexuality is illegal in 73 nations around the world and punishable by death in 17 countries, primarily clustered in the Middle East and Africa. Um, and that's a distinct difference in cultures. So if empathy is malleable and heavily influenced by culture.
You grew up in the projects of Washington, D.C., one of the only of a few coloured people at Harvard University. What moments in your life defined, for you, the role race plays in life?
Well, look, I grew up in an all-black family, neighborhood, church, schools. A lot of my friends in New Zealand find it hard to believe that it wasn't until I went to college when I was 19 years old that I actually sat down and had a conversation with a white kid for the first time. That was that. So going to then a all-white college and then subsequently to Harvard for my master's degree, I was all of a sudden a minority. It it became real and tangible for me in ways that were both provocative in terms of insight, but also a bit painful in that whole notion that in the U.S. there is still a pandemic called racism that unfortunately, growing up as a black man, look, the stats in the U.S. One out of every three black men in the states before they become 18 will sit in the back seat of a police car. That's systemic, and that became real for me into my early adult years.
Dr. Harold Hillman, thank you so much for your time. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but as you said it so well in the book, empathy is key, and this COVID pandemic appears to have proven that out.